All right, thank you, Kendra. On behalf of the National Child Passenger Safety Board, thank you for joining us for the CEU webinar, a crash course in the crash process, how it happens from beginning to end. We have a stellar group of speakers today, including National Child Passenger Safety Board members Emily Burton, Daniela Brown, James Fitzpatrick, Mike Munson, Scott Downing, and Marie Snodgrass. We look forward to a deeper dive crash course at the Kids in Motion conference this August in Madison, Wisconsin. So please join us then if you will be attending. I'm Brittany Lombard, the Child Passenger Safety Advocate on the National Child Passenger Safety Board. We do have planned time to answer questions at the end of the presentation. Please enter those questions in the Q&A box, and if possible, let us know who the question is for. Thank you. Next slide. As a reminder, attendees are requested to not participate in this webinar if you are operating a motor vehicle. This webinar will be recorded and you can listen to the recording when you arrive safely at your destination. The recording will be posted to carseateducation.org within 1 to 2 business days. For the child passenger safety technicians in attendance, this presentation qualifies for one continuing education unit or CEU. Attendance on this webinar is required for at least 45 minutes for the CEU credit. Proof of attendance will be emailed 24 hours after the webinar. When entering the CEU into your SafeKids profile, this is a webinar/teleconference, and all required information will be found on the proof of attendance email. Please join me in welcoming all of our speakers today.
Thank you, Brittany, for that wonderful intro. And I am going to kick us off if you want to flip to the next slide. Perfect. My name is Emily Burton, and I am the vehicle manufacturer representative at Honda, for the National Child Passenger Safety Board. And I'm a principal engineer at Honda, and I started at Honda in 2005, always with the goal of working in safety. It's been my passion for a long time. I'm the vehicle manufacturing rep for the National Child Passenger Safety Board, and I've been a CPST since 2017. Today, I'm excited because we have assembled 116 combined years of CPST experience for this presentation, and we are here presenting today on behalf of the board. I do want to give you a quick disclaimer before we start. A new vehicle development takes between 4 to 6 years, and I only have 8 minutes to condense that all down. So we have oversimplified many of these details, but we welcome your questions at the end of the presentation. Next slide. Nobody expects to be in a crash or wants to be in a crash, but the chances are that if you drive or ride in a car, you will be involved in one at some point. I wanted to share a few national statistics to get us started. In 2022, over 2.5 million people were injured in passenger cars. There were over 39,000 fatal crashes and over 42,000 fatalities just in 2022 alone. I also wanted to share a breakdown of what those fatal crashes include. 65% of those are front crashes. Only about 18% come from either the left or right side, and about 7% of those are rear crashes. Next slide. So what is vehicle safety? Vehicle safety is broken down into passive and active systems. Passive safety refers to the more traditional systems people think of as safety devices. That's the vehicle structure and the restraint devices such as seatbelts and airbags. In the event of a crash, the vehicle does the work for you, which is why we refer to it as a passive system. In the last 10 to 15 years, active safety features, the advanced driver assistance systems, such as automatic emergency braking and road departure mitigation, have become more common. They're getting better, and the goal with these systems is to avoid crashes altogether. Next slide. So the goal with passive safety is to manage energy, and the amount of energy in a crash is based on the vehicle mass and velocity. However, the velocity in this equation is squared. So a small increase in velocity has a big effect on total energy. Our goal as engineers working in crash safety is to balance the energy that's taken out of the system at each stage and optimize the energy into the occupant. So we're all familiar with that stage one, the vehicle crash stage. This is where the crumple zones take out energy. In stage two, the human crash, the restraint systems take additional energy out of the system. The seats, seat belts, and airbags all remove energy from the system. What's left at stage three is what the body has to absorb. And we try to optimize this system to make sure that's a manageable amount of energy. Next. In these pictures, you can see some of the structure of the vehicle highlighted in different colors. These colors show some of the high strength body members that are designed to absorb energy in the event of a crash. These are also designed specifically to prevent intrusion into the occupant space. Next. In that second stage of the crash, the restraints are carefully balanced to work in harmony to protect the occupants. Seatbelt pretensioners, door liners, interior trim, and airbag shapes, venting, and timing are all carefully tuned for optimal performance. Next. Crash events happen really quickly, and the airbags are fully deployed by about 40 milliseconds after the crash is detected. In this second slide here, you can see the steering wheel and knee airbags are fully deployed by 40 milliseconds. A human blink is between 100 and 400 milliseconds, which is at least 4 times longer than it takes the airbags to deploy. By 100 milliseconds, the occupant is interacting with the airbags, and at 200 milliseconds, you can see the occupant rebounds, most of the energy is dissipated, and the event is considered over. Next. I wanted to share a little bit about the latch requirements. So FMVSS 225 is the child anchor requirement that's related to vehicles. And this requires us to confirm the lower anchor and tether strength in several configurations. There's a couple of primary requirements. One is the longitudinal or forward pulls. We do these with and without tethers. We also have lateral side pulls, and we are also required to test standard latch positions simultaneously if there are multiple standard latch positions in one row. To give you an idea and some perspective of what these loads mean, an average Civic these days weighs about 3,000 pounds. So each seating position in this image is being tested to approximately the weight of a Civic. We also utilize these test jigs, the static force application device, or SFAD 1 and 2, for a repeatable test procedure. And recently, NHTSA issued a 225 update to add access and standard marking requirements. So you will see those come out in the next few years. Next. I also wanted to share a little bit about Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 210, the seatbelt anchor requirements. And this is the requirement that we must check for the seatbelt strength. If you think about seatbelts, a lot of times they're mounted in different locations, sometimes to the seat, the body pillar, or the floor, or a combination of those. We test these first at a subsystem level on a fixture before moving into the structure of the vehicle, before we crash test anything. And again, the load required is for both the lap and shoulder belt portion. So if a Civic weighs 3,000 pounds and both the lap and shoulder portion are each loaded to 3,000 pounds, each seatbelt gets loaded to approximately 2 Civics. In this front row image, that's with 2 seating positions tested simultaneously, that's 4 Civics. If it's a rear row where there's 3 seating positions, that's 6 Civics at the same time. Next. We also do all sorts of other testing at the component level that includes a plethora of environmental testing, hot, cold, humidity, corrosion, abrasion. The list goes on and on and on. You can see in the center picture, there's a buckle and retractor strength requirements. These there are many, many confirmations that happen even before the parts are shipped to us for subsystem or vehicle testing. And then the seatbelt anchor strength testing I just mentioned. Next slide. We then move to a system level verification. This includes seatbelt fit. If you think about seatbelts, they're adjustable to fit many different size occupants. So we have a lot of confirmations that we have to do to make sure that they fit appropriately. This is also where the seatbelt and child anchor strength testing happen. We also do static airbag deployments to make sure the timing, inflation, and venting work correctly before moving on to the restraint tuning. Next slide. Restraint tuning requires many repetitive runs. We don't do this on a full vehicle. It would be very expensive. We use a sled that simulates a crash event by accelerating the vehicle backwards, recreating the forces and timing an occupant sees during a real crash. Child restraint manufacturers use these similarly for some of their confirmation testing, and this allows quick iteration. We can do 6 to 10 sled shots in one day. Next slide. Next. Oh, maybe back one. After all of those items have been verified and tuned, we move on to the full vehicle crash test. One vehicle crash includes 200 sensors, typically 2 dummies, but it varies by mode. And we take 20 high-speed videos. We get 35 gigs of data, and we are able to do at least 1 crash per day in our facility in Ohio. It does take about 80 man hours to prep and conduct one test. So we have an entire department of folks. While we are running one test, we have 8 or more vehicles in prep for their own test. Next slide. And here's a slow motion view of a small offset barrier test at 64 kilometers per hour. This shows that the barrier engages about 25% of the front of the vehicle. This is similar to hitting a tree or a utility pole where a small amount of the vehicle is taking the majority of the impact. While I'm glad this isn't a real crash, Daniela from Up a Baby and James from Greco are going to tell us a little bit more about developing child restraints to keep kids safe if they were involved in something like this.
Thank you, Emily, so much. As my child just starts walking up as I'm getting ready to present. So I'm just going to start addressing and looking at what happens on the car seat side of things. So this is me. Hello. I am the car seat manufacturer representative as well as a vice chair elect, and I'm going to continue on so we can get down to the fun stuff. So Emily went about and talked a lot about how the adult and the occupant experience a crash. And this is something we're all really familiar with because it's in our curriculum, right? It's in the basis of everything. So, but then when we add the car seat, what happens is we tend to have more collisions. And the reason for that is when you add more factors, there's also an addition of other things that can happen. So we continue to have your vehicle to your object, right? Your car seat to the vehicle restraint. So this would be as the car seat pulls forward and stretches from the vehicle. So you're experiencing the maximum stretch from the vehicle seat belt. And then from there, the child within the car seat stretches forward in the internal harness. So there's 3 right there. And then we have the organs to the body. And then finally, in some cases, we have the body to the vehicle. So in that case, we would be looking at, in a frontal crash, possible contact with the front vehicle seat, and in a side impact collision, possible contact with a vehicle door or maybe another occupant. So each collision that occurs can increase the potential for injury. So this is a representation of a collision with a car seat, and I'm just going to run this computer-aided engineering model here. So keep in mind that we're looking at this and think of it as the vehicle has already contacted the object. Here you see the stretch right here of your vehicle belt. And then I'm going to run this one more time. And then the child winds up shifting forward, and then you see the internal harness stretch and how that's maximized. So when all of this is maximized, that's when energy absorption can start happening. The restraining force versus an adult. So we can look at this and we can say that the stopping distance of the car, for example, so this is where your point of impact happens, and then your stretch, or your stopping distance of the car stops. And then you have your movement of your driver, right? So that's your 1.5, your 1 foot right here, and then your stretch is forward from there. So the total stopping distance of the driver is at 1.5 feet. So this is just honestly, visually, just to put things in perspective for you. Now, if we look at the calculation of weight and acceleration restraining force, keep in mind that we are just using this for simply stating it for purposes of this presentation. It is a lot more involved in this, but if we look at an adult, a 160-pound adult that's traveling at 30 miles per hour, the outcome of that is we're looking at 3,200 pound force. If we factor in a child in there, so if we look at the weight of the child plus the weight of the car seat. So in this case, let's say the car seat's 25 pounds, so that equals 55 pounds. So your 55 to 30 miles per hour is 1,650 pound force, which is honestly kind of what we're looking at with our current regulation, which James is going to touch on. So just to put things in perspective here, because I'm a big person about looking at that. So about 900 pounds of punch force, and punch force would be a human being obviously applying that motion, the kinematics of that. It can break the strongest bone in the human body, so which is the femur, which is outlined in this photo. However, if we, look at like beyond that, we're looking at possible options for fatality to happen, or fatal injury. So I really like this this graph, and this kind of goes back to what Emily explained and what James is going to address when we talk about the testing on the car seat side. So when we're looking at this graph, it is the total crashes. It is not car seat specific. So I just want to be clear about that. The dark blue is the injury potential per 1,000, and your light blue is a percentage of crashes based on the type. So you have your frontal, your near side, far side, which are your side impact crashes, your rear, and your rollover. So for example, if we are looking at frontal, so that's the highest percentage of crashes that occur, but the injury potential that can happen from that is 9.5%. So when we're looking at this data, 70% of the crashes are either frontal or rear impact, which accounts for 15% of the injury. So that's a collection of your front and your rear, which is about 15% approximately. As manufacturers, we look at this data and we see how can we develop safety features in our car seats based on this kinematic, which is similar to what Emily just went through when she looked at her the statistics as to where the point of impact was in the crash condition. So all the slides previous, they show, our focus on frontal crashes, as well as what this data does that's being presented right here. And now I'm going to pass it off to James, who's going to be doing a deeper dive on the car seat testing to kind of bring this stuff full circle. Thanks, James.
Thanks, Danny. I'm going to smile really big for Tammy right now because she asked me to. Great to see everybody. Thank you for being here. So my name is James Fitzpatrick. I'm the community engagement representative on the board and senior engineer of compliance for Newell Brands, which is Graco and Baby Jogger. So we can flip over the next slide, please. So coming shortly to a car seat near you is the new frontal impact standard, which is 213B. So we're still going to continue to test to the existing 213, but the update is coming really soon. So originally when this came out, it was going to be 3 different belt types, which are type 1 belt, lap belt only, lower anchors, as well as the type 2 belt, which we call in the engineering world, versus lap shoulder belt. Very recently, NHTSA updated that. Oh, we can go back for a sec. Sorry, I'm moving a little fast. NHTSA has recently updated this, so the lap belt is going to go away. We're not going to have to test with the lap belt anymore, which was good news for everybody. And the reason for that is the lower anchors are very similar, and they react in a very similar way. Important points for technicians to note. We run 1 seat per bench per test. So 1 seat, as you see in this setup, we couldn't squeeze a second one in there if we tried. The other important thing is that we test 1 belt at a time. So we can only test with one of the belt systems. We do not, by regulation, allowed to test by both. Next slide, please. So things that you will not see on the test bench, with people assume that you will, are things like retractors, latch plates, and also buckles. So the different components of the seatbelt systems you're not going to see. And the simple reason is these things allow a lot of movement, which reduces the amount of repeatability that we see in these tests. So we see these things and we want to make these tests for compliance purposes as repeatable as possible. So things like retractors that pay out, latch plates that move, buckles that move are not part of our testing setup. All these belts are anchored at predetermined lengths and predetermined tensions. One thing that is important to note is that the webbing that we use is exactly the same type of webbing spec-wise as you would see in a vehicle. Next slide. Currently, these are the ATDs, or anthropomorphic test dummies, that we can use for frontal impact in the new 213B standard. So we have the newborn, which weighs right around 7.5 pounds and is just kind of like a beanbag. There's no instrumentation to it. We don't get any values from it, but we're looking at harness fit, making sure that they sit in there correctly, making sure that they're not going to be ejected from the harness, making sure they react the way we expect them to. The crabby 12-month-old, around 22 pounds. We've got the 3-year-old hybrid 3, which is right around 36 pounds. Our 6-year-old hybrid 3 at about 51. Our 6-year-old weighted, which is 62 pounds. Again, very little instrumentation or information from that particular dummy. We're looking again at harness retention, how it reacts in a seatbelt and a booster seat, and then all the way up to the 10-year-old at 80 pounds. So there are some assumptions that we have to make in how these things move in the seats, but these are what are available to us to test within the regulations that exist. Next slide. New for us is the new side impact standard, which comes in as 213A. There were only 2 dummies. You'll notice that here. So the first one is a 12-month-old at 22 pounds, and the new 3-year-old Q3S ATD, which is around 32 pounds, a little bit different, specifically designed for side impact testing. A couple of important points to note here. There is no type 1 belt used. So we use lap and shoulder belt, type 2 belt, and we use latch. We don't use both. We use one or the other. And there is no booster testing for 213A either. So only for harness seats will this apply. Get flip to the next one, Danny. So this is what the setup looks like for the 213A bench. So you'll notice that we paint half of the dummy's face green. It's a little weird, I know. But we paint them, and the idea is that during the test is that the dummy's head cannot impact the barrier you see on the right-hand side of the picture, so that white part of the screen. If there's paint contact, that means there's a failure to the test, and we'd have to go back to the drawing board to see how it works again. Next one, Danny. So the important thing for us to note is, number one, we know we're not as cool as Emily. We're not crashing vehicles. It's not quite as much fun, but we're doing a lot of work behind the scenes to make sure these car seats are safe. And it's very structured. There's a lot of process to it. We're making sure that we're doing things in a very repeatable way. How can misuse increase injury potential? Again, remember that everything we're doing in a lab is set process. It's over and over exactly the same way. The dummy set the same way. They're sitting in the same place. They're harnessed exactly the same way. So making sure that they're harnessed correctly, making sure that all the things are done correctly, following those instruction manuals that no one reads, are incredibly important to help reduce potential injuries in a crash. So we can go ahead to the next one. Again, this is a look at some different things across the board for different misuses pulled from the NDCFs. Thank you, NDCF team, for all the amazing data that we get from you. Harness is number one, if you look here. So there's a lot of data right at the top. Harness information, seatbelt usage, tether usage. We want you guys to use that tether because it does forgive a lot of things. So making sure that the seat is correctly used is huge in ensuring that it's done, because that's how we test it. So next, we know that misuse data can affect things. So what actually happens in a crash? Because we know that does happen as well.
Well, goodness, welcome everybody. I'm happy to see that we have a good number of people in attendance. My name is Mike Munson. I'm a peace officer here in the state of Texas, and I'm currently the public safety law enforcement representative on the board. Been involved in child passenger safety for, I don't know, about a quarter of a century. It's been a long time, but I've been there. Next slide, please. I get to take us from the pre-crash world to the post-crash world, as exciting as that may be, right? We've heard about what our vehicle manufacturers do, all the wonderful work that goes into how they develop those vehicles in order to protect our occupants, both adult and children. We've heard what our car seat manufacturers do in their design standards and their testing performances in order to make sure that, especially for our child occupants, that those kiddo seats do what they need to do in order to protect the children in those cars. We're well aware of what the federal standards are. We know that there are diligent individuals behind the scenes that are working on making our roadways safer, developing standards so that everything else can protect the occupants. But then on top of that, we take and we put a human person behind the wheel of an automobile. We put them on a roadway in an uncontrolled environment where we can't control what happens, and either through human error or unavoidable circumstances, crash happens, right? Next thing you know, the car's made the impact that Emily talked about. And as she mentioned, nobody wants to be in that crash. So from a law enforcement perspective, when that crash happens, what we need to do is we need to dispatch law enforcement personnel to the scene in order to figure out what went wrong, what worked, and what we can possibly do in the future to prevent that from happening. We can take all of the stuff that our manufacturers and vehicles and car seats have put into play. We can take those standards and statutes that exist to try to make our roadways safe and figure out what failed in this particular environment, what failed in this particular incident that caused that vehicle to collide with something else. Right, we can also look at how the occupants survived, what were the state of injuries and things that went on in that. And from that, we develop really positive solutions on the back end, things that we can do to improve roadway safety. We can document data that may allow our vehicle manufacturers or our car seat manufacturers to design something that can help protect those occupants better in the future. That's the law enforcement officer's role when we start talking about a crash anywhere on the roadway. When an officer responds, next slide, please. The officer has two primary focuses when they're arriving at a crash scene. The first one is scene safety. You have one or two law enforcement officers that show up generally on a crash scene, and their goal is to provide protection for all of those individuals that are involved in the crash. We don't want to make things worse, and we don't want to cause additional injuries based off of that. So they'll get there and they'll start to set up scene security. Right, they're going to make sure people can't get to those occupants. They're going to make sure the debris isn't causing additional crashes. They're also going to provide primary patient care if they're the first responders on the scene. Basic life-saving issue measures, nothing substantial, but something to help those occupants. Right. The second thing they're going to do once they've established that scene security, that scene safety, is they're going to actually investigate the crash, determine what happened. What was going on when that vehicle collided? Was there something that we could do to prevent that? And what were the circumstances around that particular crash? Next slide, please. We talk about scene safety, right? Ultimately, our first and primary goal in scene safety is to make sure that the occupants involved in that crash are safe. We want to make sure that nothing else happens to them. They're going to do that by blocking off areas of the roadway, keeping other motorists from trying to travel through your scene. Right, find a way to get the occupants to an area where they reduce the risk of them having some kind of a secondary involvement. We're going to make sure that vehicles are safe, right? When bad things happen and cars go bump in the middle of the roadway, sometimes we wind up with fluids and other type of hazards that those vehicles may present. We want to try to minimize the risk of that to the people that were involved in the crash, the responders that are arriving at the crash scene, and to those other people that are traveling by. I want to make sure that responders are safe. If we have a crash with serious injury or substantial damage, we're going to have a multitude of responders arriving on that scene. And our goal is to allow those responders to make sure that they can provide whatever it is they're going to provide for that scene, whether it be patient care on an EMS side, right, extrication or fire suppression from our fire responders. Whoever it is that's arriving, we want to make sure that we're keeping them safe as well. We as responders, law enforcement, and likewise can't help the individuals involved in that crash and can't perform our functions if we're not safe. We also want to make sure the roadway's safe, as it's in that one picture below, right? As soon as something happens on a roadway and we start constricting that traffic flow, we start funneling motorists into less lanes than they're used to. We start adding all kinds of really interesting stuff to look at as they pass by, right? We have to make sure that we aren't contributing to secondary crashes, that we aren't putting other motorists at risk. The idea of investigating a crash isn't to create additional crashes. So we want to make sure that all of those other motorists likewise are staying safe. We want to make sure that we're providing as much security and safety as we possibly can at that crash scene. And that's one of the primary focuses of law enforcement. Secondary focus of law enforcement, next slide please, is going to be the crash investigation. We have to start interviewing the individuals that are involved. We have to start interviewing the witnesses that saw the crash. We have to start looking at the physical evidence that the crash has left behind, points of impact, skid marks, other debris that may not result in something additional as far as information goes. We want to make sure that we're paying attention to all of that. We want to talk to the occupants. We want to determine restraint use. For the child passenger safety world, it's really critical for us to figure out what those adult occupants had their child occupants in those vehicles. We want to document all that stuff, put it on a crash report form. In a world where data is important, and I know that that was mentioned in both of my previous board members' presentations today, right? That data is critically important, but we start mixing it with real world environment. What we can document adds to and complements all of those tests that they run on in their labs. Right, so we want to document that. What type of car seat was used? Was the child secured properly? Figure out what we can do as far as that portion of our investigation goes. Start putting all of those pieces together, right? We start looking at what happened. We start looking at what failed and led to the crash. All of that leads us to great and possible improvements in vehicle safety, roadway safety, and ultimately the goal, right, which is to reduce injuries for those occupants, both adult and children in those cars. The goal is that we make a crash where those implements, those safety standards actually help protect the individuals from injury or reduce the severity of the injury depending on the crash. Next slide, please. Right, the reality is what law enforcement does is to provide a little bit of calm in that chaos, right? When cars go bump, when two vehicles or a vehicle and a fixed object try to occupy the same physical space, we want to provide some level of stability. We want to make sure that the individuals in that crash can get through what they've endured, right? They can sustain and move forward. We want to make sure that in their worst moment, we give them a little bit of calm. We bring some of that to it and help those other motorists along the way. And then post crash, we go back and we look at what we had. We look at the data. We look at what that crash report showed us, and we looked at what caused that crash and determine through reflection, right, and assessment, if there is some substantial level of improvement we can make, whether that be with a traffic engineer and roadway design, right? Document in our crash reports things that might be able to be improved or might be able to or might have failed, right, in the advent of that crash as far as our safety features go in the vehicle and the car seats, so that others can look at it and use that data. The purpose of law enforcement's role in crash investigation, the crash process, is simply that, right? It's to determine what happened, provide that reflection, and hopefully give some venue for others to make improvement in the safety as we ultimately work on reducing the injuries to those occupants. Next slide.
All right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Scott Downing. I'm the fire captain on an advanced life support engine company in Southern Oregon. I'm the public safety, fire and EMS representative, and I'm also the chair of the CPS board. All right. We're going to talk a little bit more. There's been a lot of engineering. There's a lot of forward thinking, a lot of the pre-action piece. We can back up a slide, Danny. There's a lot of thought that goes into, it looks like we're missing a slide or we skipped one. There's a lot of thought that goes into engineering and making it safer. So what's the role of the fire department? Well, we show up and we're very reactive. And so the incident has happened and we're there to kind of pick up the pieces. And right, so let's advance the slide. We're out of order. We go one more just to look, see if we got them. Nope, back up. So we're missing a slide there. That's all right. So engine 22's arrived on scene. We got a two-vehicle motor vehicle collision. Both vehicles are upright with heavy damage. Northbound lanes are blocked and occupants appear to still be in the vehicle with extrication needed. Start a second engine company. Engine 22 is going to establish Highway 101 command. So the role of the first responder is to provide for life safety at most. That's our #1 priority. but we're also looking at incident stabilization and property conservation. During a motor vehicle collision, the brief arrival report, that size up like I just gave you, kind of paints the picture for incoming responders, be it law enforcement, the Department of Transportation, other ambulances or other fire engines that are coming. And it paints that picture to kind of clue everybody into what's happening, the actions that initial company are taking, and it establishes a command structure for all those agencies to get plugged into, and helps us create objectives and assign tasks. Companies assess the scene for hazard. We use apparatus to create a safe work zone. We're shutting down roads. We're just, like Mike said, we want to prevent that secondary collision, and we want to create a safe workspace for the workers that are in there, for those EMTs and paramedics that are working, or fire companies that are doing extrication. We're going to get in there. We're going to assess the condition and the number of patients. We're going to create an incident action plan that addresses the incident needs and priorities. And then we're going to order additional resources as required. So law enforcement for traffic, the Department of Transportation, maybe to block down roads or create alternate routes for people to take, etc. So mechanism of injury. We've talked quite a bit about that in the previous slides, both Emily and Danny. But mechanism of injury describes how and with what force and on which part of the body the injury occurred. So we've talked about it, but remember those stages of a crash from your training and also earlier in the presentation. So the vehicle crash, the human crash, and then the internal crash. This information helps determine the likelihood of serious injury and what emergency care might be needed. We might be looking at chest injuries and we need to do chest decompression. We might have a whiplash or a head injury where we need to provide for C-spine protection. We might have internal injuries with bleeding, and we might need to start an IV and provide TXA, a clotter to help control internal bleeding. So those kind of things. The mechanism of injury is not the same for everyone. It depends on a whole bunch of different factors, including age, health of the patient, restraint use, and other comorbid factors that might be there. Assessing the mechanism of injury or the potential for injury is a critical aspect of the first responder's role. And as previously shown, through a lot of engineering, a lot of thought, and passive safety components on our vehicles, sometimes visible and physical injuries may not always be so obvious. So first responders need to apply a high level of suspicion, especially when it comes to crashes with moderate or heavy damage. We really need to be thinking and looking at that mechanism. So motor vehicle crashes can result in blunt force injuries that can cause multi-system injuries in a lot of variables, depending on the speed and the impact, where that vehicle is hit or what it hits. And a thorough trauma assessment and identification of injuries helps responders triage and prioritize patients, their care and extrication needs. All right, next slide. The golden hour in emergency medical services is kind of that first 60 minutes after that traumatic event. During that time, if we can identify those injuries and provide prompt care, that's going to give the patient the most likely opportunity for a good outcome. The golden hour is thought to be a key component in trauma care and EMS systems. It's used to guide how medical resources are distributed. So how are we allocating those resources as they arrive on scene? It's also used to help emergency responders prioritize treatment and resources. For those with more than a decade of experience in EMS, this concept of the golden hour is probably pretty familiar to you. The principle emphasizes the importance of transporting trauma patients to a trauma center within an hour of the injury to reduce mortality and morbidity. There's been a lot of research done over the years, and the concept's undergone a lot of revisions, but I think it still stands true. The sooner we can get on scene, the sooner that we can assess the patient, the sooner we can identify the mechanism for injury and the likelihood of things like internal bleeding, airway compromise, and we can provide treatments and transport them to definitive care, the chances of survival and for good outcomes goes way up. We can go to the next slide. And let's talk about extrication and incident stabilization. So vehicle extrication is that process of, carefully removing a person from a vehicle after an accident, particularly when they're trapped and they're unable to exit due to the damage of the car or because of their injuries. It often requires specialized tools, like you kind of see there. A lot of people refer to a spreader like that as the jaws of life. You hear that term thrown out there quite a bit. But we use those tools to dismantle parts of the vehicle to access victims safely. Primarily emergency responders like the firefighters and paramedics who are trained in using specialized tools and equipment are doing that work of removing those trapped individuals. And then we use those hydraulic tools, which can cut through metal. They can spread apart vehicle components. We can rip off doors. We can cut off roofs to gain access to a patient and remove them from the vehicle that they're entrapped in. Kind of the steps to that extrication and stabilization piece is assessing the scene. That's where that brief arrival report, spotting our vehicle. We use our great big fire engine. We kind of block the roadway to create a safe working area for the engine company. We do an inner and an outer circle so we can assess for other hazards, leaks and spills, maybe hazardous materials on a larger scale incident involving tractor trailers. And then we want to get a good, thorough patient count, and then resource allocation. That patient count is super important, and we're looking at mechanism as well, like a rollover where somebody could be ejected from the vehicle, and we might need to check the surrounding areas in the field or across the street from where it happened, where somebody might have been thrown from a vehicle. We want to account for those patients as well. We're going to stabilize the vehicle, and that's going to help prevent further injury to the trapped person and to protect the workers on the scene. That's going to keep the vehicle from moving, from rolling away. It's going to keep it in the position that it's in so that it doesn't continue to roll or move. If it's on its side, we're going to secure it so it doesn't fall over or squish somebody else. We don't want to create more patients on the scene. We're going to use things like struts and chocks, and we're going to flatten tires. We're going to make sure the car's in park. It's crazy how many cars that I've responded to, especially the newer ones that have remote keys. You don't necessarily use a key to turn the car on and off, but cars are still running and they're not always in park. Sometimes they're still in gear and they could roll off on you. We're going to tie it off using cables or winches, potentially even utilizing tow companies to help secure vehicles. With a lot of that engineering and advances, vehicles are hard to get into. They're doing a great job with crumple zones, and that just makes it more difficult. All the airbags and curtains that come down. So, for us as first responders, there's a lot of practice, cutting up cars and understanding how they're put together and understanding what happens when they're involved in a crash to help us gain access. And then we're always thinking about plan B, plan C, plan D, if plan A doesn't go so well. We talked about it, but disabling the vehicle's power, turn it off, make sure that it's in park. And these are things that can happen when it doesn't have to be the first responders. It could be a bystander that makes sure that car's in park so it doesn't roll off. So, and then after we do that, we're getting the tools out and we're cutting away. So we're using cutters, spreaders, rams, airbags, sawzalls, bars, all kinds of things to gain access. We're peeking and peeling. We're pulling the trim off to identify where the airbags are at if they didn't deploy, so we don't cut into gas cylinders and things like that. And then we're going to provide emergent care to the patient. So if needed, we're going to start first aid. We're going to identify those life threats, serious uncontrolled hemorrhage, airway compromise, and then we're going to initiate that care, triage the patients, treat those life threats, stabilize them. We're starting IVs, we're giving fluids, TXA, clotters. We're using backboard splints and those kind of things to take care of those injuries that they might see. And then we're going to pass them off to the ambulance for transport to definitive care at a hospital. And then we look at incident stabilization. So we're protecting the scene. We're going to protect property and the environment. So we're controlling leaks. In some cases, this might be a crime scene because maybe driving under the influence or something like that. And law enforcement needs to do some investigation and kind of put things back together in a serious automotive crash. teams come out and reconstruct the crash to try to determine what exactly went on. So we got to protect that scene, and then we're working, like I said, protecting the environment, containing leaks, environmental issues, hazmat issues. Sometimes fires are a result of crashes that we have to mitigate as well. And then we can go to the next slide, and then we're going to transport. So from after the patient has been extricated from the vehicle, we're passing them off to the ambulance or into a triage area, depending on the scope of the incident. And we're going to provide those findings that we found to the ambulance crew. If it's not the same company, I work in a system where it's a private ambulance, so they show up typically after the first responders do. And we want to pass off those findings. Were they wearing restraints? Were they not wearing restraints? What kind of injuries did we find? If we can include pictures of the vehicles, that's going to help the emergency department see that mechanism of injury and why we're taking it so serious sometimes when the patient might not present with obvious injuries. We're going to gather as much information as we can that passed off, history, times, and sometimes the information that we provide to the ED might be the only information they have for quite some time before other family members get there, or they communicate with other patients or law enforcement. So it's important that we provide really good detailed information to those ambulance companies to provide to the emergency department. And then just a little plug, tune in next month. We're going to talk about some safe transport recommendations of pediatric patients in ambulances. And that's what I got. We'll turn it over to Marie.
Hi, go ahead, next slide. I'm Marie Snodgrass. I'm the injury prevention lead at CS Mott Children's Hospital in Ann Arbor. I'm also the injury prevention and healthcare representative on the National Child Passenger Safety Board. Go ahead. I'm going to go fast because I want to make sure we have room and time for questions and answers at the end. So specifically kind of coming from those scenes, right? I'm tagging on to what Mike and Scott really shared with us about, coming from the scene of the incident or the crash. Our job at the trauma centers and at the hospitals is to gather clues and to predict injuries with these pediatric patients. So those details from the scene that Scott was talking about are so crucial. And it's like a real life telephone game, right? Like you heard how many people have their hands in the pot when they're on scene. So many people are involved. Mike's crew might be there initially, securing the scene and may actually help stabilize patients. And then Scott's crew comes on board, but then a private ambulance company actually does the transportation. So by the time they get to us, those people may not have actually even seen the patients in the car. So that handoff is really crucial because we're still going to ask them as many questions as we possibly can to get as many details as we can. And interpretations can really vary. So we have to be really careful about our questions when we ask them. We love when somebody tells us that a child is appropriately restrained because that means very different things for very different people. And so we ask a lot of questions. Scott mentioned photos. Yeah, photos are amazing. We get photos a lot of times from our first responders that come on scene that are transporting from scene to us. We'll get pictures of the vehicle. We'll get pictures of the car seat sometimes, or what was going on with inside the vehicle, just to give us a true idea of what happened. And it tells us sometimes like really how they were restrained or weren't restrained. And then it's really key for us, for anybody who's on the medical side of things, that anybody in the trauma bay can request a timeout. And we always really encourage that here. We want to make sure that the information is transferred appropriately and that the information is transferred quickly. So trauma bays can be really kind of chaotic sometimes because we're trying to get everything in and everything's happening so quickly. But a timeout means everybody's going to stop what they're doing so that information from that person can be heard. And so that is something that we really, really stress in our trauma bays here at U of M. Go ahead, next slide. So when we're talking about transferring, the details and kind of taking those cues and those clues from people. So those details are really important. So when someone tells us that he was in a booster seat, what does that mean, right? A booster seat might mean something very different for me than it would mean for you, than it might mean for that 20-something ambulance driver that has no kids, right? That doesn't really know what a car seat or a booster seat is, or, you know, the difference between the different types. So this is actually a scene from, or a picture from a scene. I'm not making this up. I wouldn't do that. You know that reality is better than fiction sometimes. And this is really what we had brought to us from one of our first responders. He wanted us to understand the type of booster seat that this child was in that came to us, so we could really see why the child had the injuries that he had when he came to us. Next slide, please. And then when we hear sometimes that, you know, vehicles, it was a serious crash or it was a rollover crash. So a rollover crash, did they keep rolling? Was it a one-time rollover? Was it multiple rollovers? Did they stop on the roof of their car? They stopped on the roof of their car. And okay, the infant seat was actually still installed, hanging upside down. Okay, that tells us a little bit. And then when I look closer and I go, oh, and there's a bunch of blankets inside the baby seat, and, you know, like a lot of things. So there's a lot of details and a lot of clues here that give us information that can kind of help us know maybe what we need to focus on when the babies and when the children come to us. And so a couple things to keep in mind. Go ahead, next slide. Trauma centers, well, any hospital, actually, I should say, for most hospitals, pediatric traumas make up a very small number of the patients that we see coming in, and they come in fairly infrequently. They are, however, often high intensity situations with high risk patients, right? So we need to know how to act quickly. We need to act, like Scott was saying, it's pretty fast. So depending on the time that it took responders to get the patients or the patients out of the vehicle, to get them to the rig, to get them transferred to us. We don't know how much time has passed, but, you know, by the time they get to us, we need to act fast. So we're scanning really quick. The first thing we're looking for generally is bruising. The next thing we're talking about is, the next thing we have to keep in mind is a lot of the patients that we see are nonverbal. So they're small often, or they're scared. And so they're not always talking to us. So we're always going to presume that children are injured until they're cleared by a physician. So if they come in with a collar on, that collar's staying on until we have a physician that actually clears them after they've been scanned. X-rays, CT scans, MRIs, whatever it is that they need. We are not going to assume anything. Where an adult patient can be asked questions, you know, does this hurt? Does this hurt? Can you move here? Can you see this? Can you do that? Pediatric patients are a completely different population that we cannot assume those things. And then we are really, I mean, obviously very concerned about, you know, neck and spinal cord injuries. But when I talk about bruising, just a little bit, I'm going to focus on one thing that we always look at and what we talk about. Go ahead and go to the next slide. We always kind of focus on our, you know, especially with our older patients, seatbelt syndrome. I think probably most everybody's heard of seatbelt syndrome, but if you haven't, what we're talking about is injuries that happen when somebody is restrained improperly. So injuries that happen when the seatbelt is not where it should be during a motor vehicle crash. So these are some pictures. These marks or these bruises, sometimes they're not obviously this, they're not this bold when they come in to see us, but we can see red marks, we can see abrasions, we can see things on the neck. Sometimes we can see things across, you know, red marks and whatnot across their belly. So to give us some kind of indication that, okay, something maybe happened here, or they were maybe not in a seat, or maybe they weren't in their booster seat, or maybe they had their belt behind their back because of the way that this belt, or this line is going underneath the arm and not coming up on the neck, things like that. So we pay attention to a lot of those things. And seatbelt syndrome can cause a wide range of injuries. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. We obviously, what we're looking for is that green belt, right? We're looking for that proper placement of that lap belt over the, you know, the lower hip and the thigh area. But what we see with those kiddos that are older and they're not in their booster seats, or not sitting in a belt appropriately, maybe slouching down, is that belt that rides up over the squishy part, the soft part of their belly, right? So we're talking about soft tissue issues and injuries. We look for the bruising, the abrasions. There can be some lacerations. There can be some internal bleeding. And then skeletal injuries, fractures of the spine, ribs, pelvis, clavicle, sometimes with the belt that comes up here across the neck if it's not hitting them appropriately. And then we always worry about, the organ injuries, things, that are your solid organ injuries, heart, lungs, intestines, liver, things like that. Things that are not visible on the outside, but that those red marks and that bruising can sometimes be a telltale to kind of give us a heads up about. So these are things that we watch for. And again, as Emily said, this is like the Reader's Digest version of, a couple things that we're looking for on the trauma side. But clearly we're all working together. It's a tag team of disciplines working from the engineering side all the way at the beginning with the vehicles, the car seats, on the scene with the responders and the law enforcement, to what we do here at the trauma centers and the hospitals to make sure that we get all the information and we can actually, treat our patients and handle their injuries as best we can when they come. A couple takeaways that we hope that everybody gets from this today. Obviously, we need more time because we have a lot more to share with you. So come and see us at Kim. But one of the things we want to kind of reiterate is don't make assumptions, right? Read your manuals. Models change and updates are made for reasons. Don't assume that this model, a car or a car seat, is the same as the last one you saw. So make sure that you're keeping up on your manuals and that you're reading those manuals when they come in. One thing that I wanted to mention that I think I might have gone over quickly and maybe missed in my talking, but kind of tagging onto something that Scott talked about, I think, as well. But on scene, it's really important. Talked about stabilizing patients. One of the things that we always try to stress is not to remove babies from their car seats. We always look at trying to stabilize necks and heads, necks, and spinal cords. And that car seat is doing that job for us. So if we can keep kiddos in their seat and not remove them from their seat while we're waiting for responders to come on scene, that is the best way to try to keep them stabilized until the responders can come and they can assess them. A crash outcome can affect injury potential, obviously, right? So there's so many things that we can do, and not following the car seat or vehicle instructions, presenting misuse, things like this can affect outcomes, and it can affect the severity of injuries. And then finally, the last thing I want you guys to make sure you take away is that you all make a huge difference in what happens with these kiddos. Your conversation with caregivers, there's always great takeaways, whether it's regarding the installation, other education that you're sharing with them, something about how the child is fitting in the seat. Just keep being your compassionate selves, listen, deliver information in your simple, effective ways, and keep doing the great work that you're doing, because we cannot do all of this without all of you. So thank you so much. And I'm going to end my piece right now.
All right, thank you all so much. Obviously, a ton of information packed into this hour, and we are short on time, although I think some of us do have time to stay a little bit to answer some questions. Kendra, would you like me to review the last couple slides first before we go to questions?
Yeah, go ahead, please. Thank you.
Perfect. So if you'll skip one more slide for me, please. We do have a few closing announcements before we go, and then we'll do questions next. So we hope that you're enjoying this webinar series from the National Child Passenger Safety Board. We are having a lot of fun delivering them. Hopefully you will join us in March for the webinar that Scott teased a little bit in his section, Child Passenger Safety from the Scene to the Hospital, which is an update to the CPS in Emergency Vehicles webinar. Registration will be coming soon. Next slide. Great news for all of our CPST instructors attending. If you earned your hybrid instructor endorsement with the 2020 curriculum, you now have access to the 2024 CPST hybrid certification training in the Child Passenger Safety Learning Portal. If you are not yet hybrid endorsed and would like to earn the endorsement, email your name and instructor number to trainings@cpsboard.org and you will be given access to the new curriculum. Visit CPS, next slide, please. This webinar recording will be posted to carseateducation.org within 1 to 2 days. For the child passenger safety technicians in attendance, this qualifies for 1 CEU. Proof of attendance will be emailed 24 hours after the webinar. You must enter the webinar information into your profile at cert.safekids.org to receive the CEU for recertification. All the information you need for your profile will be found in the email you receive from Zoom. Thank you so much for joining us today. Have a safe day. Thanks for all you do to help keep child passengers and their families safe in the car. I see some of the folks are answering questions in the Q&A box, so check there if you had a question. And if folks still have time, I will facilitate asking some of these now. So this is, I believe, for Mike. Katrina asked, with scene safety, does this also include the LEO shutting down the electric charge of an EV or PHEV vehicle?
Yes, scene safety includes all of that. There is some training out there for law enforcement that tells them how to do that. In a lot of cases, we would refer that to our fantastic people that work with Scott, right? We would allow our fire departments to come in and do some of that unless it was an immediate risk, but there is some training for that. So yes, it does include that.
And with the EVs too, a lot of that you can't shut off. Those batteries are going to be hot. So there's, we train and we look at the cabling. It's heavy cabling that runs from the batteries to the motors, and they're green. They're different colored, so we know not to cut into them and those kind of things. But those do possess quite a risk as well. But making sure the vehicle's shut down and in park so it doesn't continue to drive away and run somebody else over as part of that crash is super important.
Awesome. I'm also going to ask this of both of our first responders here. There's a few questions that I'm going to try and combine, so I'll try and get all that information together. But with the lack of, I guess, trained CPSTs among law enforcement and first responders in general, how are they assessing whether seats are properly installed with things like belt webbing, stretching during a crash? How are they assessing, and what kind of training are there for those folks?
Well, I'll go ahead and jump in first, Scott, if you don't mind. First of all, there's some fantastic training at carseateducation.org if you want to look at the car seat basics for law enforcement. There is no standardized training for law enforcement officers across the country. Unfortunately, that's up to each individual state standards. I know most of those are not thorough. They do what they can. We encourage anybody who works in the car seat industry or works with children that are in car seats to pass that information along to their law enforcement officers, because right now they do the best they can based off of what their crash reports in those states ask for. And sometimes that's not as complete and as thorough as we'd like it to be.
And we're doing the same kind of stuff locally with the departments that I work with in my region, just providing that awareness for law enforcement. I've had some friends that were actively involved in child passenger safety who also worked in law that were on part of those STAR teams or those serious traffic accident reconstruction teams to go out and look. And so they had a little bit more knowledge, both on what happens during a crash and then also, what it looks like to have a child restraint properly installed.
There's programs in individual states that cover quite a bit that as well, right? We've got 2 separate organizations in Texas that teach a 4-hour enforcement course for law enforcement officers, which would give them that base information. It comes with CEU credits. It's also been a presentation, I believe, at Lifesavers Conference a couple of times, as well as Kids in Motion. So there is resources out there if you're looking to develop those in your area.
That's fantastic. I think this question.
Can I say
Sorry,
one
go
thing really
ahead.
quick?
Yes.
I'm sorry. I always encourage people to, if you've got the ability to, or work within networks, like I work really closely with a lot of the law enforcement in our area, to the point where I sometimes get calls now from some of our law enforcement officers to like come and look at post-crash vehicles and say, like, they'll ask me to come help them assess. And I always tell them I really can't assess a whole lot, but I can tell you what I see, as far as how the seat was installed, what it was installed with, if it was installed properly, when they're looking at, incidents or, fatalities, especially, or things like that. Like I've had them call. So I think that sometimes, making those inroads sometimes with your law enforcement and kind of offering sometimes to be their person if they have questions, or they want somebody that they can reach out to when they have questions about certain situations. That's worked out really well in our area too.
Awesome. I'm going to pose this to any of our crash testing folks, Emily, James, Daniela. Do we know when the crash test dummies were last updated?
I just.
Oh, Daniela just typed that. Sorry if you didn't see it.
You're good.
It's on, go for it.
Thanks, Daniela.
Go ahead,
It was pre-2010 before the newest regulation, so it's been quite a few years.
Beautiful. And I think that was the majority of the questions that I could get answered. If you did have a question go unanswered, please email secretariat@cpsboard.org. And we will try and get that answer for you. Kendra, if you'll go ahead and stop the recording.